August 27th, 1964. Police officers arrive at a ranch in the foothills of Sierra Nevada, and what they discover horrifies them. A young boy, only 15 years old, has murdered his grandparents. He's shot both with his .22 caliber hunting rifle and stabbed his grandmother repeatedly with a kitchen knife. And now, here he is, waiting patiently to be taken into custody. The crime was baffling. Why would a young boy commit such a terrible act? But while the police thought the ordeal was over, the killer apprehended, the victims discovered, the nightmare passed, the much more terrifying story had only just begun, because this 15-year-old boy would grow into one of the most menacing, intelligent, and influential serial killers that has ever lived, changing the way the FBI would understand the mind of a murderer forever, and he would do it right under the authorities' noses. This is the story of Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer, and the man who brought him to justice. Our story begins on December the 18th, 1948, in Burbank, California. Edmund Kemper was a middle child, the only son of his mother Clarnell, Elizabeth Kemper, and his father Edmund Kemper Jr. Their marriage was not a loving one. Clarnell was neurotic, oppressive, and prone to alcoholism. She would berate her husband, calling his job as an electrician menial. He was a World War II veteran, and her treatment spurred him to remark that suicide missions in wartime were nothing compared to living with Clarnell. But it was their son, not their marriage, who would come to define their lives, particularly Clarnell's. Edmund was an abnormally large newborn, weighing 13 pounds, and this size would come to distinguish him. By age 4, he was noticeably taller than his peers, but that wasn't the only difference. A violent inner world existed within Edmund Kemper, one that grew and festered during childhood, developing into antisocial behavior. As early as age 10, he was killing his pets and keeping their remains. He even killed a cat because it preferred his sister, stashing the remains in a closet until his mother found them. Although just a boy, he began thinking of females sexually. He was a chronic daydreamer at school, drifting off into his twisted fantasies and dark imagination, and this began to manifest in the real world. He would steal his sister's dolls to enact strange rites. These rites would end with the removal of the dolls' heads and hands. Although a seemingly innocuous detail, it is chilling for one simple fact. Years later, it is exactly what he would do to his many victims. Was this desire learned, or was it innate? Either way, his inner life began to reveal itself when his sister Susan teased him about kissing a teacher. Edmund replied, "If I kiss her, I'd have to kill her first." But it was his actions alone at nightfall that were even more bizarre. Taking his father's bayonet, he would sneak out of the house and stalk through the shadows, making his way to his teacher's home. There, cloaked in darkness, he would watch her through the window. Death soon became a fascination. Playing with his sister, he would instruct her to tie him up. Once he was secured, she would pretend to flip a switch and Kemper would fall to the floor, squirming, shaking, and moaning. He was acting out his execution by gas or electric shock. His parents separated and then divorced in 1961. This devastated young Kemper. He felt close to his father, but was made to live with his mother Clarnell in Helena, Montana. For Kemper, this was a living nightmare. As bad as Clarnell was to her former husband, she was even worse to her son, frequently subjecting him to abuse and mockery over his abnormally tall height. She was distant, cold, and lacking affection, refusing to show him love out of an irrational fear it would turn him gay. Kemper would hear her telling his father that he was a real weirdo. And to Kemper himself, she would tell him that no woman would ever love him. From these details, some have suggested she suffered from borderline personality disorder. As an adult, Kemper would describe her as a sick, angry woman, while also showing the wounds of someone who never felt their mother's love. Worse still, she would force him to sleep in a locked basement due to fears he would harm his sisters. But alone in the darkness, his violent fantasies and hatred of women found a fertile environment to ensnare him forever. Little did Clarnell know how much this decision would come back to bite her. At age 14, he fled home searching for his father in Van Nuys. Alone and desperate, trying to reach the father he lost, Kemper eventually arrived at his house, but what he found was devastating. His father had remarried and even had a new stepson. Although Kemper was allowed to stay for a short time, it soon became clear his father didn't want him. And with his mother planning to marry her third husband, she didn't want him either. Kemper had no one. So a decision was made that he would go to live with his paternal grandparents. Although Clarnell warned her ex-husband that she wouldn't be surprised if their son killed his grandparents one day. Little did she know how accurate that prediction would be. As the African proverb states, a child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. Rather than being saved by his grandparents, Kemper would now embark on the brutal path that would define his life. It's 1964. Kemper is 15 years old and living on his grandparents' ranch. He's a walking time bomb that nobody has the aptitude or insight to defuse, and he's about to go off. Kemper hated his life. His grandfather was old and, in Kemper's words, senile, and his grandmother bossed him around, telling him what to do, constantly emasculating the both of them. For Kemper, this was more of the same, and he began to harbor fantasies of murdering and butchering her, the same fantasies he'd harbored for his mother, Clarnell. And on this day, August 27th, 1964, Kemper's fantasies became his reality. An argument with his grandmother boiled over. Kemper stormed off in rage, and when he returned, he bandaged a .22 caliber rifle that his grandfather had given him as a Christmas present. When she saw Kemper with the rifle, she reportedly said, "Oh, you better not be shooting the birds again." Kemper spun around, shot her in the head, and then twice in the back. She was dead. It was an impulsive act, and he dragged her corpse into the bedroom, and it was here that he heard his grandfather's car on the driveway. He had returned from the grocery shopping, but he didn't make it inside the house. 15-year-old Kemper took his rifle once more and shot and killed his grandfather in the driveway. With both his grandparents dead, murdered by his own hands, Kemper didn't know what to do, so he did what any scared boy would. He called his mother. What she said to him that day, only Edmund knows, but her prediction had come true, so she told her son to call the police. He did as his mother asked and waited for them to arrive while relaxing on the porch with his grandparents' corpses turning cold. Kemper's crimes fascinated professionals. He told authorities that he just wanted to see what it felt like to kill grandma, and that he killed his grandfather because he didn't want him to discover his dead wife. He didn't want his grandfather to be angry at him. Nobody could believe a 15-year-old could commit such an act. What had motivated it? Was he insane? An initial diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia was given in court, a condition that causes flight of ideas, delusions, hallucinations, and bizarre thinking. The court sent him to a maximum security prison for mentally ill criminals, and it was here that the intricacies of Kemper's personality became more apparent. Kemper was remarkably intelligent, with an IQ of over 145. He was introspective, endearing, and a model prisoner. The diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia was contested. It was clear that Kemper exhibited none of the key traits. This was a lucid, clear-thinking young man who was diagnosed with personality trait disturbance, passive-aggressive type. Now, I'm not a professional psychiatrist, but one does have to wonder, what's passive-aggressive about shooting your grandparents with a hunting rifle? Kemper was so competent and well-liked by the staff that they allowed him to administer tests on other inmates. He was a good worker, not like your typical sociopath. He undertook his work seriously and with pride, but privately, Kemper was learning. He memorized responses to 28 assessment tests, a remarkable feat, and one that gave him the means to convince doctors he was fit for release. And on December the 18th, 1968, at just 21, Kemper succeeded. But he was released into the hands of the person authorities never wanted him to see again, the one person on earth who seemed destined to make him worse, his mother, Clarnell. During Kemper's imprisonment, his mother had remarried, then divorced again. She was now working at the University of California in Santa Cruz. Kemper attempted to build a life of his own, and he applied to be a police officer, but to his dismay, he was rejected on unique grounds. He was too big. In his early 20s, Kemper was a staggering 6'9" tall and well-built, a giant powerhouse of a man that the police nicknamed Big Ed. Although unable to secure work in the police, Kemper's likable personality continued to bear fruit. He had befriended many policemen and spent time with them at local bars such as the jury room where law enforcement hung out. They enjoyed his company and noted his personality quirks such as his love of John Wayne.
I said you, Valance. You pick it up.
But what they didn't see was his dark inner life, which had continued to fester within him. And to no surprise, his relationship with his mother Clarnell had grown bitter once more, often exploding into vicious arguments. She would belittle him and refuse to introduce him to women, saying he didn't deserve to get to know them. He knew he had to escape her. Although he managed to save money and move out to live with a friend in Alameda, his mother still pursued him. She phoned him out of the blue. She showed up in person without warning. She would not let him go. And his own life made things worse. His financial difficulties pushed him back towards her, forcing him to move back in, and just like before, their conflicts and her abuse continued. It's worth noting that Clarnell's co-workers described her very differently from Kemper. Where he described her as domineering, abusive, and vindictive, they said she was charming and easygoing. And she did help him, after all, providing him with a place to live, and I think that's important to remember because much of what we know about her comes from Kemper himself, who may not have been the most reliable of sources. Either way, their conflicts began to fuel what was growing within him. After securing a job in the highway division, Kemper noticed something that he could not stop thinking about.
A lot of people give hitchhikers a lot of flack about how dangerous hitchhiking is and how they shouldn't do it.
There were a very large number of young women hitchhiking every day, all along the state highway. This reality possessed him and he began thinking about kidnapping. Soon he started furnishing his car with knives, plastic bags, and handcuffs. Edmund was preparing, and eventually he began picking up women. By his own account, he picked up 150 women during this time, but not to murder, to peacefully let go. In an interview, he recalled this time.
And I'm picking up young women, and I'm going a little bit farther each time. It's a daring kind of a thing. At first there wasn't a gun. I'm driving along. We go to a vulnerable place where there aren't people watching, where I could act out, and I say, no, I can't. And then a gun is in the car, hidden. And this craving, this awful, raging, eating feeling inside. I could feel it consuming my insides. This fantastic passion. It was overwhelming me. It was like drugs. It was like alcohol. A little isn't enough.
He even blamed the women. In his own words, they were flaunting in my face the fact they could do any damn thing they wanted and that society is as screwed up as it is. He also read police novels to gain tricks and tactics he could use on women. He learned how to get them to trust him and feel safe and how to keep the car door locked while they were inside. Eventually, homicidal sexual urges that he called little zapples would swell within him, and it wasn't long before he would act upon them. On May the 7th, 1972, Kemper met two women. They were 18 years old, hitchhiking from Fresno State University. One was Mary Ann Pesce, the other was Anita Mary Lucchesa. Kemper offered them a ride to Stanford University. He later stated, "It was the first time I went looking for someone to kill, and it's two people, not one, and they're dead. Very naive too, painfully naive in that they thought they were streetwise." He also described them as a better class of people than the scroungy, messy, dirty, smelly hippie types I wasn't interested in. He knew of a secluded location from his work at the highway department. Once there, he handcuffed Mary Ann, but as he did, the back of his hand touched her breast. He flushed with embarrassment and apologized. Moments later, he stabbed and strangled both women to death. Placing their bodies in the trunk of his car, he drove back to his apartment, but then he saw red and blue lights flashing in his rearview mirror. It was the police. Kemper pulled his Ford Galaxy over to the side of the road and the officer stepped out of the car and approached. He explained that Kemper had a broken taillight. The corpses of the two women were still in the trunk of the car, but Kemper remained calm, and inside, he felt a growing excitement. If the officer looked in the trunk, he knew he would have to kill him, and he felt ready. But the officer didn't do a routine check. He let him off with a warning and sent him on his way. Returning to his apartment, Kemper took the bodies inside. His roommate was out, so he had plenty of time. He undressed them, photographed their bodies, and savored his complete possession of them. Then he had intercourse with their bodies, dismembered them, and put them into a plastic bag. He took their remains to Loma Prieta Mountain, had irrumatio with their severed heads, then cast them into a ravine. At their respective homes, the families of the two women began to worry. They hadn't returned home. They phoned the police, but it wasn't until August 1972 that they'd get an answer, when Mary Ann's skull was discovered. The authorities began a comprehensive search of the area, looking for any sign of more remains, but nothing was found. And as for Kemper, he returned to picking up women and giving them a ride to their destination. He ferried them around safely, even going as far as to talk to them about the man killing female hitchhikers. But throughout, his dark impulses remained. He noted, "When someone put their hand on my car door handle, they were giving me their life. Eventually, someone else did." On September the 14th, 1972, Kemper killed again. Aiko Koo was a 15-year-old dance student. She had missed her bus to class, so she had decided to hitchhike, and it was Kemper who found her. Driving her to a remote area, Kemper revealed a gun, but it was here that he made a mistake. Getting out of the car, he locked himself out, leaving Koo with the gun. But she was too frightened to reach for it. Instead, she led him back inside, where Kemper choked her unconscious, raped her, then killed her. Like his previous victims, he stored her body in the trunk of his car, and after his grisly work, he decided to have a drink. Kemper drove to a nearby bar, and when he finished, he looked over Koo's corpse and said that he was admiring his catch like a fisherman. Back at his apartment, he followed a similar routine as before. He again had intercourse with the corpse, cut it into pieces, then disposed of it, but not before something astonishing happened. The next day, Kemper was summoned to meet a panel of psychiatrists as part of his parole. They were to screen him for his mental health and see if he was fit to be part of society. Less than 24 hours after murdering Aiko Koo, Kemper underwent the examination, but he was experienced. He had studied their tests and knew exactly what to say. He knew what they wanted to hear, and he crafted the persona he needed. Eventually, the doctors presented their findings. The first said he saw no reason Kemper was dangerous. The second went as far to call him normal and safe. It was clear they were confident this former child killer was cured, but in his private heart, Kemper delighted at fooling them. Some have even said that while the tests were happening, Aiko Koo's severed head was in the trunk of his car. However, Kemper denies this. The doctors sent their findings to a judge. Meanwhile, Kemper buried Koo's remains above Boulder Creek. As time went on, her frightened mother became worried about her daughter's absence. She contacted the police, reporting her disappearance, and put up hundreds of missing person flyers. Nobody came forward with information, and she never saw her daughter again. On November the 29th, 1972, the results of the psychiatric examination had its desired effect. Despite some protesting from a judge, Kemper was rehabilitated. His juvenile records were permanently expunged. He had his freedom. One psychiatrist stated, "If I were to see this patient without having any history available or getting any history from him, I would see no psychiatric reason to consider him to be of any danger to himself or to any member of society." Remember, by this point, Kemper had hunted and killed 3 women. A free man, he continued to pursue his relationship with the police, even though he was the co-ed killer they were searching for. But Kemper had motives beyond just friendship. As FBI profiler John Douglas would say many years later, Kemper was learning from the police. He uncovered their methods and discovered how to avoid capture. He learned how to make people feel safe. But his urge to kill continued to grow. At times, he attributed this to fights with his mother. Other times, he suggested there was a different, deeper reason.
My frustration, my inability to communicate socially, sexually. I wasn't impotent, but emotionally I was impotent. I was scared to death of failing in male-female relationships.
No matter what his motivation may have been, his urge to kill had reached a boiling point. Kemper struck again on January the 7th, 1973, when he picked up Cynthia Ann Cindy Schall and shot her with a .22 caliber pistol. He had recently moved back to his mother's house and he stored Schall's body in a closet overnight. Amazingly, his mother didn't find it. When she left for work the next day, Kemper had sex with Schall's corpse and removed the bullet. He engaged in irrematio with her head for several days before burying it face up in the garden. Kemper claimed he had it facing up for his mother because she always wanted people to look up at her. Another detective claimed Kemper took satisfaction in knowing Cynthia was in his garden, looking at the sky. Kemper discarded the rest of her dismembered remains into the sea. Her torso washed ashore, a surfer discovered her left hand, and eventually a pathologist pieced her together. It was determined she'd been cut to pieces with a power saw. A month later, on February the 5th, Kemper found 2 more victims. Suspicion had grown that a serial killer was operating in Santa Cruz. Students were instructed to only accept rides from people brandishing a university sticker. Kemper had little trouble using his mother's job to acquire one.
My mother worked at the campus and I had an A sticker on my car and obvious access day or night to the campus. I was picking up some very lovely young women.
Kemper had argued with his mother and went to the university in search of victims. He found Rosalind Thorpe, who happily joined him in the car. She treated him like a fellow student. Kemper also found Allison Liu. He described the events as follows. Miss Liu was sitting in the back right behind Miss Thorpe. I went on down a ways and slowed down. I remarked on the beautiful view. I hesitated for several seconds. I had been moving my pistol from down below my leg in my lap. I picked it up and pulled the trigger. As I fired, she fell against the window. Miss Liu panicked. I had to fire through her hands. She was moving around and I missed twice. He killed both women before even leaving the university grounds, then wrapped their corpses in blankets. And when he reached the university gates, he was waved through. He told the guards that the girls were drunk and he was trying to get them back to their dorms. He later noted,
Getting easier to do. I was getting better at it. I was getting less detectable. I started flaunting.
He brought the bodies back to his mother's house, had sex with them, and then dismembered them. He took care to remove the bullets and the next day discarded their remains.
Both girls had been decapitated and the hands from one body had been cut off. Alice Liu and Rosalind Thorpe were last seen February 5th. Miss Thorpe while hitchhiking from campus, Miss Liu at the university library.
Around this time, Kemper met another young woman, a blonde 17-year-old from Turlock High School. He met her on Santa Cruz Beach, but unlike his victims, he did not kidnap and murder her.
During that time, I become engaged to someone who's young and is beautiful and very much the same advantages and very much the same upbringing.
They became engaged in March 1973, and as the months went by, Kemper felt a desire to stop, to abandon his killings. He claims he even picked up 2 women identical to his first victims, but let them go.
Almost identical circumstances. And I let them go. Everything went towards killing them, and I didn't. But I'm saying, wow, it's uncanny. It was almost like it was meant to be that way. And I said, wow, this gotta stop. And I let them out.
He considered turning himself in, but his fear of imprisonment stopped him. And little more than 3 weeks later, his new fiancée and the world would learn the horrifying truth as Kemper was about to claim his final victims. April the 20th, 1973. Kemper was sleeping in his room at his mother's house when he heard a noise. She had loudly come home from a party. When he found her in her room, she was reading a book. She looked up and said condescendingly, "I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now." Kemper said no, told her good night, and left the room. When she was asleep, he returned, hit her with a claw hammer, and then slit her throat. He killed his mother. In a later interview, he said once the act was finished, he started to cry and put his hand to his mouth. In his other murders, he'd felt nothing, but not here.
I cut off her head, and I humiliated her corpse. So there, you know, a 6 young woman dead because of the way she raises her son and the way her son is raised, the way he grows up. And what's her closing words? I suppose you want to sit up all night and talk. God, I wish I had.
Later, he claimed he murdered her to spare her the embarrassment of discovering that her son was the co-ed killer. He also stated that he was afraid she'd find the items he'd taken from his victims. He also knew deep down that he could not escape her. Kemper put her severed head on a shelf and vented a lifetime of anger. For the first time, he could say everything he wanted to say. For the first time, she did not argue with him. Later, he threw darts at her, smashed her face, and put her severed tongue and larynx in the garbage disposal. After storing her corpse in the closet, he left the house and went for a drink with his friends. They were police officers. Little did any of them know he'd just committed matricide. Returning home, he called his mother's best friend, 59-year-old Sarah Taylor Sally Hallett. He invited her to watch a movie and have dinner. As she walked through the door, Kemper hit her and strangled her. When she was dead, he laid her naked corpse on the bed. At 5 a.m., he left a note for the police, then fled the house. It read, "Approx 5:15 a.m. Saturday. No need for her to suffer anymore at the hands of this horrible, murderous butcher. It was quick, asleep, the way I wanted it. Not sloppy and incomplete, gents. Just a lack of time. I got things to do." He fled for over 1,000 miles, hopped up on caffeine pills. He was convinced he was being pursued by an active manhunt. He had 3 guns and 200 rounds of ammunition ready to defend himself. He was frightened, nervous, and worn out. But there was no news on the radio, no mention of Kemper, no mention of his mother or friend, nothing. Finally, he arrived at his destination, Pueblo, Colorado. But rather than keep running or hide or use his weaponry on people, he did the unexpected. He turned himself in. He called the police, the same police he was friends with, the same police who trusted him and would drink with him. At first, they thought it was a prank, their buddy winding them up. It wasn't until one officer, Sergeant Alufi, was dispatched to Kemper's home that the truth was discovered.
Aptos, just a few miles south of Santa Cruz, where this morning about 5:30, county sheriff's investigators found the bodies of two women, one of them decapitated and her right hand cut off. The bodies were found in closets in the apartment home of one of the victims because, police say, the son of that victim called Santa Cruz police from Pueblo, Colorado this morning and told them about the murders. At the sheriff's office in downtown Santa Cruz, Sheriff Douglas James said that call came from 24-year-old Edmund Emil Kemper, who lived at the address where the murder victims were discovered, and that Kemper was arrested in a Pueblo phone booth.
Kemper was brought into custody and he confessed to everything. The 6 students he'd killed, his mother and her friend. He even took detectives to where he'd stashed the bodies. He confessed to having sex with their heads and said that he loved the feeling of possessing them. For the police, many of whom were Kemper's friends, this was horrifying. The co-ed butcher had eluded them for so long because he didn't just know their methods, he knew them personally. And they hadn't caught him. Nobody had. Because the only man who brought Kemper to justice was the killer himself. May 7th, 1973, Kemper was indicted on 8 counts of first-degree murder. While awaiting trial, he slashed his wrists twice, but he survived both suicide attempts. Because of his detailed confession, Kemper's only legal option was to plead guilty by reason of insanity, but to do so, he and his defense would have to prove it in court. His trial began on October the 23rd, 1973. 3 psychiatrists found Kemper to be legally sane. One even interviewed him under the influence of truth serum. Here, Kemper claimed he ate the cooked flesh of his victims in a casserole, although he later denied this. Kemper was found to be fully cognizant for each murder and appeared to enjoy the infamy of being known as a murderer. On November the 1st, 1973, Kemper attempted to convince the jury himself. He stated he had killed his victims because he wanted them like possessions. He explained his acts of necrophilia and argued that only an insane man would do this. He stated that 2 beings inhabited him. One of them was a killer, and when it took over, it was like blacking out. But his efforts failed, and on November the 8th, Kemper was declared sane and found guilty on all accounts. He requested the death penalty, specifically by torture. This was the same kind of death he had acted out as a child. Again, he failed because California had a moratorium on capital punishment. He received 7 years to life for each count and was sentenced to California Medical Facility in Vacaville. He was locked up in the same block as the killers who had haunted California before him, Herbert Mullin and Charles Manson. Kemper disliked Mullin intensely. He used his enormous size to bully and control him, dominating Mullin's actions. He said, "Mullin had a habit of singing and bothering people, so I threw water on him to shut him up. Then, when he was a good boy, I'd give him peanuts. Herbie liked peanuts. That was effective because pretty soon he asked permission to sing. That's called behavior modification treatment." Prison psychiatrists soon diagnosed Kemper with antisocial, narcissistic, and schizotypal personality disorders. But other than his treatment of Mullin, Kemper proved to be a model prisoner. He scheduled appointments for other prisoners, crafted ceramic cups. He even recorded 5,000 hours of audiobooks for the visually impaired.
Reaching for the internal controls. 3PO was shocked. Behave yourself, R2.
But it was his interviews with the FBI that had the most lasting impact, as they would change our understanding of serial killers forever. During road trips in the 1970s, FBI Special Agents John Douglas and Robert R. Resler came up with the idea of interviewing notorious killers. Their goal was to learn how the minds of these criminals worked. Many of their interviews were with Kemper. They observed that Kemper only became emotionally moved when discussing his mother.
Shit. And I looked at her, I said, no. I said, good night. And I knew I was gonna kill her.
He told them all about her cruelty. He revealed that he would often sneak into her room and imagine killing her with a hammer. To Douglas, it seemed that all of Kemper's fantasies and victims were surrogates of his real target, his mother, Clarnell. His overriding fantasy was to be rid of her. Ed Kemper will be up for parole this year, in 2024.